In chapter 46 of your book, you go on to critique Rabbi Benny Lau for his depiction of the origin of 13 hermeneutical rules in his book, The Sages, which, by the way, we love. We have to just mention that we're not here.
I'll get to that later.
We're not here to criticize.
This is a hard one for me.
Yeah.
Sorry, should we skip it?
So he asserts that, well, we're interested in truth, you know.
Yeah.
So for us, it doesn't matter who said it. We're interested in the truth. So he asserts that halakha was born out of rabbinic conscience and imagination, as opposed to an organized tradition, meaning it was their own creation as opposed to a set of rules handed down by Moshe. This idea is evident in his readings of the disputes between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, as well as the Agadot, which discuss their feud. Could you break down the reasons why you strongly disagree with his position, and maybe give us a background about what he said?
Okay, so I mean, first of all, just to distinguish between two different things in your question. There's halakha being born out of the rabbinic conscience and imagination, and then there's the 13 hermeneutical rules. So I definitely I go through from the basis of the Rambam that certainly there was a rabbinic, we'll call it the Beit Din HaGadol, whatever it was. There's influence over halakha. The way the Rambam describes it, I go through this in more detail in the book, is that the ikarim mekubalim, the central perush mekubal, the central meaning, the central themes of each commandment, exactly how broadly we want to define that. There's a lot of discussion, but the central themes of every commandment was revealed to Moshe. It was transmitted through the generations, and there was no dispute over that. There was no change over that. The details, the pratim, the finer details of each commandment were handed over to the Beit Din HaGadol, to the sages of each generation, to develop as they saw fit. And there's definitely room within that, the rabbinic conscience, and to try and arrange things. This is something in my next book, please God, I'm going into quite a bit more about exactly what the boundaries are, what they could and they couldn't do at the time of Sanhedrin, or the time where there's no Sanhedrin. But there was certainly, it's true, there's a rabbinic influence over the Torah, especially at the time of the Sanhedrin. That is very clear, and that is not something I take exception to in this chapter of Rabbi Lau. What I take exception to is something he quotes really right at the start of his book. It's through the hermeneutical principles, the midot she'Torah nidreshet b'hem, the principles through which the Torah is expounded in halachot are drawn out of it. We get a clear idea from various writings of the Rambam, the introduction to Sefer HaMitzvot, the introduction to the Mishnah, various other places, that these principles, and it comes out of the Gemara as well, these principles come from Moshe through the generations. And Moshe taught these various techniques of darshan the Torah, and through them we were supposed to create and help us read and understand the intention of the Torah. As Rabbi Lau says right at the start of his book, that without any sort of discussion or qualification or indication this might be something controversial, he says straight out, Hillel invented the hermeneutical laws. He came from the study hall of Shema and Avtalion. He came along and he invented them straight up. So he fully takes on a theory which, as far as I can see, I researched this for a while. It seems to have originated with a German historian called Dr. Heinrich Graetz, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, who was a member of the Reform movement, German Reform historian, and he came up with this grand theory of that the midot she'Torah nidreshet b'hem, the hermeneutical rules through which many of the halachot of the Torah seem to have been developed through, were actually created by the rabbis. And he doesn't mention Heinrich Graetz anywhere in his introduction, but as far as I can see, this is where this theory comes from. Unlike, we mentioned the critique of Mark Shapiro before, but by the way, most of the book isn't critique, so you get this impression that I spend most of the book having a go at people. There's a few isolated chapters where I take on certain theories which have become popular recently. But yeah, unlike this critique of Mark Shapiro, this argument I have with Rabbi Benny Lau isn't really my own. As I make clear in the book, it's strongly based on the writings of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, who dedicated a whole volume of his collected writings to his own critique of Heinrich Graetz a couple of centuries ago. It was a bit of a personal issue in those days. Graetz was actually a Ben Bayit. He grew up for several years in Rav Hirsch's house. He describes Rav Hirsch's heavy schedule. They got up early every morning. They studied Mikra together. They studied Tehillim together. Then they studied Kant, I think, and then they studied Gemara together for a while. That was all before Shachrit. They got up like four something in the morning. So they were very close, Graetz and Rav Hirsch. And after a certain amount of time, Graetz rejected Orthodox Judaism. The way the Jewish society in Germany was moving in the day was very much throwing off the halakha. And he moved into the Reform movement. And this created a very powerful dispute between the two of them. And Rav Hirsch wrote, it is hundreds of pages in response to Graetz's theory. And it bothered me both that Rabbi Lau hadn't mentioned Graetz's theory at all, which seems to be the origin of this idea, nor had he any reference or response to Rav Hirsch's very powerful critique. So what are the problems? Why do I object so much to Rabbi Lau's historical invention of this in the sages? So it's not really so much because it's misleading, but first of all, the Tanaim, the Amarim, strongly indicate in many places that these 13 midot, the 13 hermeneutical rules, are of Sinaitic origin. They come from Sinai. This is something which I'm exploring more in the upcoming book, as I say, on the oral tradition. It's significant in terms of the value and the status of expounding the Torah using these principles. Are you doing something? When you take a Shabbat, Kal V'chomer, and you start trying to understand how it's working, are you doing something which is of Sinaitic origin? Is something biblical, or is just something which came up in the imagination of the sages and could be done away with at a later stage? It's also significant in knowing the status of the laws which are created through such drashos. Are they real laws being created? Are they asmachtot? Are they genuine derivations? So this can have a very big impact in that sense. And secondly, Rabbi Benny Lau just takes us at the beginning. He then seeks to interpret the entire Tanaic literature through the prism of the battles between the students of Hillel, who he depicts as being more creative, more lenient, taking on these new creative rules for expounding the Torah, and the students of Shammai, who he depicts as being conservative with a small c, and wanting to hang on to the tradition and being very against any innovative ways of expounding the Torah. And not only is this very false, because as I was going to go on to show, both Hillel and Shammai use these laws, and this is not the subject of any of their disputes really. It also creates a very insulting and demeaning perspective on the entire Tanaic project, that so many of these disputes between the Tanaim are seen as personal grudges and power struggles, whereas if you're looking at them without the certain reading that Graetz and Benny Lau put on it, this doesn't seem to reflect the truth.
Well, we hope to have Benny Lau on the show one day to answer back, and Mark Shapiro.
I tried to contact him before the book was put out. It's a different matter.
All right,
the linchpin of the theory, the linchpin of Dr. Graetz and Rabbi Benny Lau's theory is an account of Hillel arriving in Jerusalem. He arrives, it's Shabbat, it's Erev Pesach. They've got to perform the Korban Pesach, the sacrifice, and they don't know how to do it on Shabbat, which is a question in its own right, why they don't know how to do it. Has the calendar been manipulated in the past, or what exactly is going on? But however it is, it's the B'nai B'Teira, who are the Nisim, they're in charge of the Sanhedrin, whatever it is, they're in charge of Jerusalem at the time, and they do not know how the sacrifice should it be allowed, should not be allowed, how could it be performed. And Hillel is described. It's something which comes up in the Bavli and the Yerushalmi. He's depicted as having introduced these new drashot. He comes along in front of the B'nai B'Teira and he presents all these new methods for resolving the problem. He presents Gezerah Shava, which equates which equates the Korban Pesach and the Korban Tamid to show that they can both be done on Shabbat. There's a Gezerah Shabbat, and Dr. Great and therefore Rabbi Lau conclude that, well, no one knew these arguments before Hillel had come along, therefore it must be that Hillel has invented the argument. And pretty much the whole theory builds upon this. And I said, well, Hillel invented these new methods, his students continued that, and the B'nai B'Tzera begrudgingly, they weren't very happy with it, and Shammai stuck very firmly against it. And it's all built up of this episode of Hillel. However, as Rav Hirsch points out, this line of reasoning only works if we ignore certain crucial details within the Talmudic account of what went on. The Yerushalmi, which has the fullest account of this meeting, this confrontation, you've got to call it, between Hillel and the B'nai B'Tzera in Pesachim, the sixth parak of the start of the Pesachim in Yerushalmi, describes how the B'nai B'Tzera, who are the leaders in Jerusalem, they responded to Hillel. They were not amazed, they were not aghast at his new methods of innovation, rather they responded, just as Tanaic sages do throughout the Mishnah and the Tosefta. They accepted the legitimacy of these derivational principles, of the Hekesh, the Gezerah Shavah, the Kal V'chomer, and they offered counter-arguments, pirchas, to try and dispute the specific application Hillel suggests. They said, yes, this Gezerah Shavah, this Hekesh that you mentioned, but I've got a pircha because, and they give a specific response to it. And shockingly, both Dr. Greats and Rabbi Benny Lau, in their accounts of this event, they omit these counter-arguments from the quotations. If you look at it, the passages of which describe the confrontation between Hillel and the B'nai B'Tzera omit these responses of the B'nai B'Tzera. And then they advance the theory that the B'nai B'Tzera had no idea about these principles of expounding the Torah, and Hillel invented them. Whereas, if you note, if you see that Hillel presented these arguments and they accepted the principles and they had a small minor, they said this Hekesh is fine, but it doesn't quite work because of a detail. If you're disputing a detail, that means you've accepted the general principle of the argument, but you said the application is incorrect. Like we find throughout the Toseftas, throughout the Midrashei Halacha, that one rabbi will propose a Gezerah Shavah, and the other one will say, well, it's not quite right, I've got a slightly different suggestion. So in other words, this whole theory is built on a fraud. It's a total misrepresentation, a misquotation of the Talmudic source. There are many more details that you can find in my book. There's just a brief summary. But based on this, is what Rav Hirsch calls a fabrication of Hillel having invented the hermeneutical rules, we find this whole false dynamic and tension which allegedly ran through the Tanaic study hall based on the principles of Darshan the Torah. We have Shammai, we have Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus being seen as rejecting Hillel's creativity. And these are theories that, as Rav Hirsch shows, fly in the face of all the legal disputes we find in the Talmud between them. Rav Hirsch, being a proper Yekka, doesn't just give these broad arguments like I do. He undertakes a careful accounting of the sources. He reports that there are 280 disputes between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel across the Tanaic literature. 245 of them, which is the vast majority, are totally unrelated to anything of how to interpret the Torah's text. So we see this is not a major theme in their disputes. If they had a major dispute about how to darshan the Torah, you'd expect to find key halachic differences which are traced back to read the Torah that way, read the Torah another way. Can you learn a Gezerah Shavah? Can you not learn a Gezerah Shavah? But no, the vast majority of all their disputes don't even relate to any interpretation of the Torah's text. There's not a single example of Shammai rejecting a hermeneutical rule of Hillel. We don't find it anywhere in the Tanaic texts. If anything, it's the other way around. There's one very high-profile dispute between the academies of Hillel and Shammai. It's in the first chapter of Yevamot about the Tzorat Ereva. We're going to go into the details of the case, but what we find is there's the Academy of Shammai, a member of Shammai who's trying to support his position, is advancing hundreds of sharp and novel arguments, while Beit Hillel adhere closely to a received tradition they claim to have from the prophets. So again, this is something which, the theory which creates, and Rabbi Lau takes on, just it doesn't fit with the accounts we have of the halachic disputes between them. It carries on to Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. There's the famous dispute of the Tanur Shel Achnai, the oven of Achnai, where Rabbi Eliezer is arguing with the sages about whether a certain type of oven is pure or impure, and even though he asked all these divine signs and they're granted, yet we say that no, we follow the majority. Lo b'shamayim, the Torah is not in heaven. We follow the majority. And again, Dr. Greats and Rabbi Lau, they depict Rabbi Eliezer as being the student of Shammai, who's clinging strongly to tradition. He's not willing to give way, even with all the innovative arguments of his colleagues. And they're advancing all these creative ideas about how to expound things. And Rabbi Eliezer is clinging strongly, and he's even prepared to be put into cherem. He's sent away as a result of it. But again, this is not a dispute over how to expound the Torah. And the Gemara describes it to Rabbi Eliezer, who's advancing arguments all day. So again, time after time, and I bring many more examples of this in my book, we find that the characterizing that we find from Dr. Greats and Rabbi Lau does not fit the details of the Tanaic disputes that we find, and therefore it's a misrepresentation both of the origin of the hermeneutical laws and of the sort of disputes and the dynamic we find throughout the academies of the Tanaim.
Well said. Beautiful.
All right.